Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to Auntie Grace Speaks. Today's story is different from the ones I usually tell. It is not a story about betrayal or revenge or a marriage that fell apart. It is a story about a secret. A secret that one woman carried for over 50 years, completely alone, and took with her to her grave. Or so she thought. This is the story of the Patterson family, and I need you to stay with me until the very end. Because the twist in this story is one I did not see coming, and I don't think you will either. Ruth Elaine Patterson was, by every account, the most ordinary, extraordinary woman you could ever meet. She was 81 years old when she passed quietly, in her sleep, in the same house in Savannah, Georgia, where she had lived for 53 years. Her children found her in the morning, looking peaceful, her hands folded on top of her quilt, as though she had simply decided that it was time. Ruth had 3 children, Diane, the oldest, who was practical and organized and handled every difficult thing the family had ever faced, Carl, the middle child, who had moved to Detroit 30 years ago and called every Sunday without fail, and little Rose, the youngest, who still lived in Savannah and had been her mother's closest companion for the last decade of her life. Ruth had been a seamstress her whole life. She sewed from the time she was 12 years old, wedding dresses, church clothes, school uniforms, curtains, quilts. Her hands were always moving, even in her 70s, when arthritis had stiffened her fingers. She could still thread a needle faster than anyone in the room. She was a woman of routine. Church every Sunday, garden every morning, sweet tea every afternoon on the back porch. She did not travel. She did not spend money on anything she considered unnecessary. She did not talk about the past. That last part, her children had always found it a little unusual. When they asked about her childhood, about her parents, about the years before she married their father Samuel, Ruth would smile and say, "That was a long time ago, baby. Some things are better left where they are." They had learned not to push. 3 days after the funeral, Diane, Carl, and Rose gathered at the house to begin the difficult work of going through their mother's belongings. Ruth had not owned much. Her wardrobe was simple. Her kitchen was stocked with the same things it had always held. Her bedroom was neat and spare, a bed, a dresser, a nightstand with her Bible and her reading glasses, and a small framed photograph of her late husband Samuel. It was Rose who found it. She was on her knees pulling things from under the bed, old a spare quilt, a bag of fabric scraps Ruth had saved for years, when her hand hit something solid, a metal box, dark green, about the size of a large hardcover book, with a small brass lock on the front. Rose called her brother and sister into the room. The 3 of them knelt around it on the bedroom floor and looked at each other. Diane said, "Did any of you know this was here?" Carl said, "I've never seen it in my life." Rose shook her head. They searched the room for a key. The dresser drawers, the nightstand, the closet shelf, the pockets of Ruth's coats. Nothing. Carl eventually used a small flathead screwdriver to work the lock open. It took him 20 minutes. Inside the box were 4 things. The first was a bundle of letters, maybe 30 of them, tied together with a piece of blue ribbon. The envelopes were old and yellowed, the ink faded. They were all addressed to the same person. In the same handwriting, Miss Ruth Elaine Mosley. Her maiden name. The second was a small black and white photograph. A young woman who was unmistakably Ruth, maybe 19 or 20 years old, standing beside a man none of them had ever seen. He was tall, light-skinned, smiling broadly. Ruth was looking up at him with an expression her children had never seen on their mother's face before. Pure, unguarded joy. The third was a document. Official-looking. A single page, folded in thirds. The fourth was a child's drawing, crayon on notebook paper, old and fragile. A house, a tree, a sun. And at the bottom, in a child's handwriting, "For Mama, I love you. James." The three of them looked at that child's drawing for a long time. None of them was named James, and their mother had never once mentioned anyone named James in her entire life. Diane read the letters first. She was the oldest. She was the practical one. She told Carl and Rose to give her an hour. They sat in the living room and waited. When Diane came out, her face was different, softer. Something had shifted behind her eyes. She sat down across from her brother and sister and she said, "I need to tell you both something about Mama. Something she never told us. Something I think she spent 50 years trying to forget. And 50 years being unable to." The letters were from a man named William Curtis Hayes. Ruth had loved William before she ever met their father Samuel. She had loved him when she was 17 years old, completely, recklessly, in the way that love when they don't yet know how much loving someone can cost. William had loved her back. The letters were proof of that. 40 years later, the words still burned off the page, tender, urgent, full of plans and promises and a future the two of them had mapped out together in careful detail. But William was not the kind of man Ruth's family had approved of. He was from the wrong neighborhood. He had the wrong last name. He had no money and no prospects, and Ruth's father, a severe, proud man, had forbidden the relationship, absolutely. Ruth had been 19 years old when she discovered she was pregnant. She had told William. He had been overjoyed, had said they would get married immediately, that her father would have no choice but to accept it. But Ruth's father had other plans. Within 2 weeks, Ruth had been sent to live with a relative 3 states away. The baby, a boy, born in the spring of 1961, had been placed for adoption before Ruth ever held him. She had been allowed to name him. She had named him James. She had been brought back home 6 months later, as though nothing had happened. She had never spoken of it again. Not to William, who she never saw after that. Not to Samuel, who she married 3 years later. Not to Diane, Carl, or Rose. Her 3 children who had grown up in that Savannah house, never, knowing they had a brother somewhere in the world. Carl unfolded the document while Diane was still talking. It was an original birth certificate, issued in the state of Alabama in April of 1961. The mother's name, Ruth Elaine Mosley. The father's name, William Curtis Hayes. The child's name, James William Hayes. Carl held it with both hands and didn't speak for a long time. Rose was crying quietly. Diane said, she kept his drawing. She kept his birth certificate. She kept every letter William ever wrote her. For over 50 years, she kept them in that box under her bed. And she never said a single word. Carl said, "Do you think she ever tried to find him?" Diane was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "I think she was afraid. I think she was afraid that he had built a good life and that appearing in it would only cause pain. I think she was afraid that he would hate her for what she had done, even though it wasn't really her choice." Rose said, "She carried this her whole life. She went to church every Sunday and she cooked Sunday dinner and she sat on the back porch with her sweet tea, and the whole time she was carrying this, alone." The 3 of them sat in their mother's living room, surrounded by 50 years of silence, and they grieved, not just for Ruth, but for a brother they had never known, for William, who had lost the woman he loved and the son he never held, for all the years that had been swallowed by one proud man's decision. It was Carl who suggested they try to find James. Diane and Rose agreed. It took them 6 weeks, a genealogy website, a DNA test, 3 phone calls to adoption record offices in Alabama, and finally, a name. James William Hayes, adopted at 3 months old by a family named Porter, raised in Birmingham. Now 62 years old. His name, the name he had lived his whole life under, was James Porter. He was a retired He had 3 grown children. He had been married for 34 years to a woman named Gloria. And this is the part that made all 3 of them go completely still. James Porter had spent 20 years searching for his birth mother. He had hired a private investigator in 2003, had registered on every adoption reunion database available. He had submitted his DNA to 3 different genealogy services. The most recent submission, just 8 months before Ruth passed away. 8 months. If Ruth had lived 8 more months, the DNA match would have come through. She would have seen his name on the screen. She would have known that James had been looking for her, that he did not hate her, that he had spent 2 decades trying to find his way back to the woman who had named him and kept his drawing and locked it in a green metal box under her bed for 50 years. Diane made the phone call to James. She said, "My name is Diane Patterson. I believe my mother was Ruth Elaine Mosley. And I think I believe that you have been looking for her." There was a long silence on the other end. And then James Porter said, his voice breaking on every word, "I have been looking for her my whole life. Is she still alive?" Diane closed her eyes. She said, "She passed away 6 weeks ago. I am so sorry, but she kept your drawing." "James, she kept it in a locked box under her bed for 50 years. Your drawing and your birth certificate and every letter your father ever wrote her. She kept all of it." James did not speak for almost a full minute. When he did, he said only this, "She remembered me." James Porter came to Savannah the following month. He stood in Ruth's kitchen, the kitchen where his half-siblings had grown up, and he held the green metal box in his hands and he wept. Diane gave him the letters. She gave him the photograph his mother and his father, young and joyful, and full of a future that never came. She gave him his birth certificate, and she gave him his drawing. He held that crayon drawing, 62 years old, a retired school teacher with grandchildren of his own, and he held it like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched, because it was. He had 3 siblings now. They were strangers who shared the same mother's eyes. They had Sunday dinner together. Rose made Ruth's recipes. Carl told stories about growing up in that house. Diane showed James the photographs of their mother through the years, at 60, at 70, at 80, sitting on the back porch with her sweet tea. James looked at every photograph for a very long time. At the end of the evening, he said, "She looked kind. She looked like someone who loved her family." Rose said, "She did. She loved us more than anything in the world. And I think I know she loved you too. Every single day. In her own quiet, heartbroken way." My dear friends, Ruth Elaine Patterson went to her grave with a secret she thought would die with her. But love, real love, has a way of surviving everything. Even silence. Even 50 years. Even death. James found his way back. Not to his mother. That door had closed 8 months too soon. But to the proof that she had never stopped thinking of him. Never stopped holding on. A locked box. A child's drawing. 3 words written in crayon. "For Mama, I love you." She kept it, all of it. For 50 years. And that is a kind of love that no lock in the world can contain. If this story moved you, please like this video. Subscribe to Auntie Grace Speaks. And share it with someone who needs to hear it today. New stories every single week. Because every story here can change your heart. Auntie Grace.